Hello and welcome to What's in It for Africa, the Inside the Issue show with me, Uzo Madu. In this edition, we're going to go inside the issue of the Global Climate Change Conference talks at COP21 and find out who are the winners and losers, the EU or Africa. And to help us do so, we're going to be speaking to Collins Nweke, a Green Party councillor for Ostend City Council and a Global Affairs Analyst, and Manel Mselmi, who's a researcher in environmental studies. Climate change is officially a priority for the Africa-EU partnership, and it has worked quite well on projects such as enabling better access for African countries onto the carbon markets, or on projects such as the Great Green Wall for the Sahara. Now, this looks at the sustainable use and management of forest lands and other natural resources. However, the partnership has been greatly criticised for not reconciling African and EU interests. So, let's take a look at both of these interests. The EU has been a leader in international climate policy discussions. Not only has it reduced considerably its greenhouse gas emissions, it has also contributed financially to non-EU countries in managing the effects of climate change and reducing the risks. However, its historical greenhouse gas emissions does oblige the EU to do more. The Africa Group, on the other hand, does little to pollute but will pay the highest price. African countries are one of the most vulnerable regions in the world. Due to poverty levels, large areas with scarce water resources, and also a dependence on rain-fed agriculture. Therefore, finance for climate change is increasingly and incredibly important for African countries, and it has been a bone of contention between the EU and Africa. This means that at the COP21 discussions, African countries, along with other developing countries, did require or request $100 billion a year US dollars from developed countries, including the European Union. In addition to financial disagreements, another more central issue is the rate at which to cap global warming. Now, the European Union and other developed states such as the US at COP21 push for a limit of 2 degrees. And African countries, along with other developing countries, push for a rate at 1.5 degrees. Now, research has shown us that limiting it at 1.5 degrees could potentially save up to 100 million lives globally. So, with this in mind and the imposing views on finance and on a cap on global warming, we asked our interviewees, is it credible for the EU and Africa to work together on climate change?
Well, I would personally frown at a relationship that is based on just setting up a relationship without necessarily setting up a target that is genuine and achievable. And I hope that the EU-Africa relationship or partnership on climate change is not one of such. Having said that, I believe that there are a few things that point to the fact that it isn't. Now, if you look at, for example, in 2011, when I think the conference took place in Lima or Durban, indeed, these were the discussions, the negotiations that took place prior to the 2015 climate change conference that has just held in Paris. We're actually building blocks, okay? Building blocks between Africa and EU that helped to mobilize the sort of consensus that actually led to the 2015 conference. So yes, it is a necessary one, but then it needs to be effective as long as it is not a standalone in terms of not feeding into the global agenda. But I believe there are reasons to believe that it's feeding into the global agenda.
I think that there is a need to work together actually on international issues, not only climate change, but also extremism, refugee crisis. And this is what the EU Commissioner on Environment, Mr. Vella, highlighted it in Valletta Summit in Malta. He said, we have everything to gain from working together. And that need is urgent. So rising seas that threaten islands, as he mentioned, climate change is everyday problem, and it's the reality for millions. It is not a north-south issue, it is a global issue. All countries are affected by global warming, all countries are affected by climate change and poverty. So it's true that climate change has severe consequences on the African continents more than other continents and more than other countries, but I think that it is really important to work together, especially on water crisis, on food crisis, because this would have an impact on Europe and on the world if we don't take the necessary measures to combat climate change, such as having climate refugees, for instance.
Now, after considering the relative merits of the EU-Africa relationship on climate change, we focus more specifically on the COP21 negotiations and outcomes. The world was watching and waiting, and so we asked, who were the winners and losers at COP21, the EU or Africa?
That's a very good question, and I hope I'm not going to be subjective in my response. Honestly, if you asked me, I would say that the biggest winner is the climate itself. The reason is the climate itself is because more than ever before, much more awareness has been created about the need for actions to be taken. And what I found rather remarkable is the way that civil society organizations, non-state actors have actually been mobilized, to begin to sing the same tune, and that is the tune of do something if we are going to avert, the catastrophe that is impending. Now, viewed from all of these, you would place Africa as the ultimate winner because the effect of, climate change the impact rather is going to be felt more in Africa than in other places, and so the more people talk about it, the better for Africa in terms of averting the impending catastrophe. In terms of the losers, I would want to think that the big lobbyists who have actually been doing everything they can to play down climate science, because of course they have a lot to lose. They are more interested, in making a profit at the cost of individual health and the environment. I believe they are the losers. The reason they are the losers is because much more people are becoming aware. They are getting more enlightened, more educated about the menace of climate change.
I think that it's a difficult question to answer to. The answer is not yet here. But apparently there was, as we said, it's a historic, between quotation mark, climate deal. A first reading of this agreement reveals that countries have to limit the rise of global average temperature to below 2 degrees Celsius by 2100 and show slow warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and end fossil fuels, etc., and be committed to clean and renewable energy. So first of all, the first winners are developing countries, because they are going to benefit from $100 billion by 2020. And have certain programs to be helped in terms of fighting against climate change and invest in renewable and wind and solar energy. However, there is no legal commitment on the part of industrial countries to fulfill this promise. Of course, we have renewable energy markets, and investors are part of the winners, especially working in wind and solar energy. in EU and Africa, of course, and the losers, the coal and fossil fuel companies, China, for instance, as it is the world's biggest coal consumer. African countries such as Ghana, Ethiopia, and South Africa are already committing to their own adaptation efforts. However, countries such as Tanzania, Cameroon, Egypt, Senegal witnessed problems of water crisis, high sea level, and need support to fight against climate change.
Then we looked into the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. This principle looks at the fact that the polluter pays. It also takes into account that developed countries, through the industrialization process, have contributed more to global environmental problems in comparison to developing countries. Now, it also takes into account the fact that these developed countries have more economic and technical capabilities to overcome these global environmental problems. So we asked whether the principle of common but differentiated responsibility was reflected in the COP21 discussions.
Yeah. Well, the principle of differentiated responsibility is one that actually plays very well into the entire discussion of climate change and how do we move forward from where we are today. Now, viewed from a historical perspective, the industrialized countries have actually made the wrong choices in terms of the sort of investment they made in their industrialization process. Now, that is not to say that it's helpful here to begin to play the blame game. No, certainly not. However, you need to know where the issue arose from. Now, on the other hand, it is very obvious that African countries pollute much less. Yet, we also know that they are going to bear the brunt more than the industrialized nation because of weak infrastructure, among other things. So, viewed globally, I think it makes all the sense in the world to see climate change as everybody's problem. Okay, everybody's problem then requires solution that cuts across the board. Now, what that means from my perspective is that those who have been polluting the most, but also have the capacity to mitigate and finance adaptations, should not hesitate to do that. And they should go just beyond lip service, Concrete actions, have got to be taken, and I am happy that in Paris, at the COP21, very, serious discussions actually took place to the point, as we know, that France has actually, pledged 2 billion euros to Africa to help in the process of adaptation and mitigation. Now, we hope that it's not going to be recycling of old funds. That is going to be fresh injection of capital. You see, so viewed from that perspective, I believe that it's something that could be managed properly.
I think it is possible to have an agreement between Africa and the EU regarding climate change if we have a determination and will to work together. And I think that there should be a dialogue, of course, between the two continents on further reflection on the equity principle. Of course, a dialogue about balanced contributors to the debate on differentiation and mitigation, commitment in the post-2020 climate change regime. So there should be more global attention towards adaptation and, of course, a dialogue on adaptation finance effectiveness.
So it is credible and necessary for the EU to work with Africa on climate change, not only because of the historical emissions of the EU, but also the vulnerability of African countries to climate change. And although at COP21 it meant that Africa essentially lost out on limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, it did win in securing the $100 billion of finance every year. So it does seem that their relationship, especially in the COP21 context, was furthered and strengthened. So it seems that EU climate change policy in the future could have a bit more in it for Africa. So that's it. Thank you for watching the Inside the Issue on the COP21 negotiations. Remember to follow us on Twitter and subscribe on YouTube. My name is Uzo Madu for What's in It for Africa.